I want to talk about the historical narratives and ghosts that continue to haunt the present, which is what inspired the study days in Accra in April this year. We traveled to Accra, inviting Gabi Ngcobo, who's an artist in the exhibition, and Bienal de São Paulo, and also Tiago de Paula Souza. And we traveled to Accra as an attempt to connect the dots and to find historical blind spots, beginning from the moment in 1835 in Bahia, Salvador, when an uprising by a number of African slaves took place. Retracing the historical and most significant slave rebellion in Brazil, the Mali Revolt. We went to Accra to track the Tabong people, who are the descendants of a group of about 8 families who were leaders of the revolt and who were deemed powerful and dangerous, leading to their deportation back to Africa in 1836. Traces of these resettlements exist in the West African nations through Portuguese names of former slave descendants, as well as architectural remnants. The most well-known being the Brazil House located in Jamestown, one of the oldest districts in the city of Accra, a place with a weighty history. Jamestown is a point where slaves were shipped from and became, post-independence, a point of symbolic returns. The Accra Study Days employed this historical backdrop only as a starting point. The meeting also took place in reciprocal spaces where participants engaged in discussions ranging from translation or perhaps the untranslatability of identities, the impossibilities of returning, and the role of art in times of uncertainty. What questions can we pose to the ghost, for example, of W.E.B. Du Bois, the African-American sociologist and Pan-Africanist, historian and civil rights activist who died in Accra whilst working on the new encyclopedia of the African diaspora, commissioned by Gabi Ngcobo. We also asked, for example, if we complicate his concept of double consciousness by proposing critical parallax or alternative viewfinders that could allow for redoubled movements of ideas and thus allow for spaces of radical interventions. Ngcobo Helen Sibidi's yet untitled work, created during a residence in Salvador, Bahia, where she was for 2.5 months, makes historical connections to this period. It exposes history's double standards by creating a montage of the political field, referencing from her work titled Tears of Africa, created in 1988 and shown for the first time in 1989 as walls and metaphorical and real were beginning to form. Vivian Kakuru's Tabong Bass, commissioned for Live Uncertainty, reconnects through a musical journey and sound these narratives. It features 10 musicians and producers from Ghana. The sounds reverberates in the Biennale space, as you just heard, 3 minutes of each hour. It intervenes in spaces of historical amnesia that seems to define both spaces, Ghana and Brazil, and compels us to regard the complexities of historical memory and proposes through collaborations ways to cure our collective amnesia, track unexplored or untranslatable narratives, and resist against forgetting. These strategies can be found in a number of works featured in the Bienal. Carlos Waters' installation towards homoerotic historiography is also an attempt at filling the blanks left in official historical records. The artist considers the colonization and repression of indigenous peoples' sexualities. His micro-sized replicas of pre-Columbian figurines addresses the relationship between religion, law, sin, and crime, and exposes the way in which practices and discourses of violence affected bodies and subjectivities, erased customs and behaviors at odds with colonizing Christian morals. On the other hand, Lyle Ashton Harris Umavez the title of his installation on the third floor, constructs collective and private narratives intertwined both with public events such as the Black Popular Culture Conference in 1991, the Truce Between the Crisp and the Bloods in 1992, the Black Male exhibition curated by Thelma Golden at the Whitney Museum in 1994, and the Black Nations, Queer Nations Conference in 1995. These narratives weigh in to discuss identity, desire, sexuality, and loss. The assemblage of this personal archive serves not only to memorialize, but also to evoke lived moments at the intersection of the personal as the political. Donna Kukama, on the other hand, stages 3 performances imagined as chapters of a book, beginning with Chapter C, The Genealogy of Pain, which will take place at the Consular South Cemetery from 6:15 on the 7th of September, on Saturday. This performance inserts a history of death of marginalized people, often but not always violent. Onto the physical side, the stories begin in a cemetery and spread on to other parts of the world. Chapter A, The Anatomy of History, which will take place at the Museu Afro-Brazil at 5:30 p.m. on the 9th of September, is a short history lesson given through Masketlane, which is a game played by children in Southern Africa. The focus of the history lesson is not to foreground dates and events, but rather to look at bodies that underwent these events. Masketlane is a game where stories are narrated with the use of objects, usually stones. As the story is told, a trace of evidence is left behind, creating what could be understood as a drawing. These traces act both as written document of the experiences of the bodies played by objects from the museum, as well as momentary entry into the museum's collection. Chapter B, which is the last chapter, is titled I, Too, and will take place at the Biennale's auditorium on the 10th of September from 7 p.m. It is a list that closes the 3-chapter series. It functions a bit like credits at the end of the film, except it never quite stops. The performance, which has no real beginning or end, is the longest of the 3 and functions as a monument of endurance, listing names of people and events associated with discriminatory acts of hate, racist, sexist, homophobic, etc., whether publicly or privately. These narratives reflect on shifting and uneasy entanglements. Many complement each other, some may even cancel each other out, and perhaps even activate more enabling, freeing ways of memorializing and of thinking about possible futures.